We are going to discuss pros and cons of privatization in India. This term has got currency with the new industry policy of July 1991. This term was suggested as one of the reform measures of the functioning of public sector enterprises. The question is whether privatization is suitable for India or not. There is a debate about this, and the debate is very strong one. There are groups of people who support privatization, there are people who oppose privatization. Generally, private sector wants that there should be privatization, and there are some political parties who completely oppose any kind of privatization. The point is, if we want to reform the working of public sector enterprises, some amount of privatization is bound to be there. As a result of this, the government, through its industrial policy of July 1991, introduced the term privatization in that policy. Of course, this term sometimes also confused with the term liberalization, globalization also. Now we have two experts in this field who are with us today. Professor Flubber Dutt was the director of the School of Correspondence Courses of University of Delhi, and he first initiated the discussion about privatization in India, particularly in the academic field. In his presidential address, he brought the focus for discussion on the privatization of public sector enterprises in India. The next guest is Professor P.D. Hazela, who has been Professor of Economics at the University of Allahabad, also Vice Chancellor of that university, and Vice Chancellor of some universities of Madhya Pradesh also. Now I ask Professor Dutt to say something about the meaning of the term privatization, because it is a very confused term in the sense meaning different things to different people. So please clear the term itself.
No, Professor Singh, privatization has both a narrow concept and a broad concept. In the narrow sense, privatization means induction of private ownership in a public sector concern. Well, it can be 100% induction of private ownership, which means denationalization. That is, the entire ownership of the unit is passed on to the private sector. There can be various other shades in between. These shades have been described as joint ventures. When we speak of joint ventures, we have different kinds of models. One is 26% private sector and 74% public sector. In this, still the dominant role is that of the public sector, although 26% share capital is passed on to the private sector. There is another model which speaks of 49% private sector, 51% public sector. This again creates a dominance for the public sector unit. But then we move to other models where we say 51% to the private sector, 49% to the public sector. Here we are giving more autonomy, greater say to the private sector. We have now introduced that up to 74% we can go in the private sector, 26%. And even then we say, well, government will hold a decisive power in vital matters. Now, therefore, we have these joint ventures as different shades of privatization, different degrees of privatization.
When we talk of different degrees of privatization, in terms of, you can say, transferring of shares to the private sector, now will Professor Hazela, you say, which sector can you identify where government should have larger share?
Well, the criteria that we were discussing in our previous discussion were all related to investment priority.
Yes.
There are certain prioritizations which are needed in a resource-hungry economy in the larger interest of the community. So if it is infrastructure, if it is capital goods, then I think the continuance of the public sector should not only be welcome, but should be encouraged also. You see, I would like to say one word about the capital goods sector. I think it is known that some of the Southeast Asian economies, like Singapore, for example, doesn't have any good capital goods sector at all. And the history of technological change suggests that countries which have had a very large capital goods sector, thriving capital goods sector, tend to have technological innovation faster than other countries. We have that base, luckily. So in my opinion, that priority must be persisted with. So where the public sector is in these sectors, the public sector should be encouraged, of course, in a reform fashion. But we have discussed the issue earlier, how to reform and what to do in the matter.
Now, when we talk of this kind of privatization, that the core sector, infrastructure sector, capital goods sector should remain in the government control, or the public sector should manage those areas. Now, the question is that the government has allowed through its industrial policy a larger say for the private sector to enter in these industries as well. So there is a possibility that due to competition in the same area between public and private sector, some improvement may take place even in the public sector without diluting the share of the government. So the very threat of the privatization, to my mind, will improve the working of the existing public sector enterprises as well.
Now, in this context, I would like to say one thing. We are sometimes bogged down about the privatization of individual units. When we are talking of privatization of individual units, it means introducing a certain amount of ownership from the public sector. That is one aspect of privatization. The other is the privatization of the economy. When you are opening the economies in areas which were hitherto reserved for the public sector, then what is happening is that over a period of time, may be in 5 years, in 10 years, the share of the private sector in total investment will begin to rise. For instance, in the 9th plan, the share of the public sector investment is relatively kept at a lower level, and that of the private sector is being kept at a higher level because of this change of policy. Therefore, the privatization of the economy is taking place with the new wave, because public sector is not expansionary phase is over. So we can think of privatization of the individual units. We can also think of privatization of the economy as a whole, because new units are coming, whether if they are coming in steel plants, engineering units, in locomotive industries, in some other areas. If they can come up in the private sector, then private sector share in the economy will be enlarged. This is the sense in which I look upon as the process of change that is taking place, and let us not get bogged down only to the public sector units as such.
Yes. Now, you have made a very fine distinction in the sense that privatization of the economy and privatization of a particular industrial firm. Now, in this context, the new industry policy is going to privatize the economy. But so far as question of privatization of particular public sector unit is concerned, there is still a kind of confusion in the government mind. Now I am talking here in this particular
confusion. There is the government is clear. What the government does is it puts a signal. For instance, on one day you will get a statement from a minister that government intends to privatize banks. Now the whole purpose of this statement is to get a feedback and the extent of the reaction that takes place. If the reaction is too wide, the government withdraws because it has not made a decision at all.
This means government also plays politics in
So
this.
that is happening, and even the bureaucracy plays politics, because it is said that the public sector units are the colonies of bureaucrats and politicians, and nobody wants to leave one's colony, and therefore vested interest of the politician and the bureaucrats is that the public sector should continue. And if it is to be privatized, then they should be able to get into it. Therefore, there is inbuilt opposition in the privatization of the public sector units by the government and the bureaucracy. The third opponent is the trade unions. Trade unions feel that in the public sector, we are having better emoluments, lesser work, less burdensome, less demanding, and therefore we should continue. And if the whole thing goes on to the private sector, then the trade unions will lose. Therefore, there are very strong trade unions in the public sector units. So, all the trade unions from the extreme left to the extreme right, the BMS, AITUC, HMS, all are opposed to privatization. And although they otherwise BMS philosophy maybe they may talk of privatization, but so far as the union is concerned, it opposes privatization.
When we talk of privatization of particular units, not of the economy, because to my mind, the privatization of the economy has taken place or taking place.
It is taking place.
Now the point is that some of the private sector units were nationalized by the government, brought in the public sector.
At one time.
Yes, at one time during Mrs. Gandhi's regime. At that point of time, number of textile industries were taken in, nationalized, and the result was that despite being public sector units, the government failed to modernize those units. And today the question is that such units should be closed down, or because they are said as sick units. If you see the loss of the public sector enterprises, it is said that more than 50% of the losses of public sector enterprises is incurred on these particular sick textile units. Now, will Professor Hazela say something what to do about these sick textile units or in other sectors also?
I agree that the issue of modernization is very important, and that the government didn't modernize, the public sector didn't modernize. But I'll put a counter question here. Assuming that the private sector is able to modernize, what about labor intensity? What about capital per labor? If you allow the capital per labor to rise sharply in the name of modernization, you bring down the rate of employment in the economy. You see, if it's a question of just one or two units, it's all right. But if you're talking about the economy as a whole, it's very clear the impact is going to be very detrimental so far as the employment situation is concerned. Even countries which are so modernized as the West, you find that the rate of unemployment continues to remain high and they can do nothing about it. So the more you move into that mode, the more you discover you cannot do anything about the people. So it is because the people are going to be marginalized that the public sector has to be in the picture. So the public sector has a responsibility of modernizing at the same time in a manner that employment intensity remains high as long as full employment in the economy has not been achieved. You see, in this connection,
I would like to say one thing. both the public and the private sector, in the sense in which we are talking, they are limited to a very organized sector of the economy, which accounts for only 10% of the total employment. Bulk of the employment is in the small scale, in the informal sector that is taking place. Although one can say informal sector is totally privatized, that is not state-owned at all. And therefore, but the discussion about privatization just gets equated with corporatization. That is, change from public corporations to private sector corporations. That's the kind of general feeling that is there.
But what I'm referring to, if I may intervene, is the generality of approach.
Right.
You are thinking in terms of the organized sector. Yes. You are thinking of employment intensity of an organized sector.
Right.
And you think that that is a different kind of a challenge. Yes. And that it doesn't matter if the private sector is not able to generate employment, we will be able to make up the leeway by concentrating on the unorganized sector. But if you remember, Dr. Dutt, the World Bank itself has recommended that all the safeguards that have been given to the small sector must, as far as possible, be dismantled in course of time.
No, there I don't agree. There I don't agree at all. Because, you know, I personally feel that the output growth and employment growth, these two objectives in the economy must be reconciled. If you do not reconcile them,
that's precisely the point I'm making.
That's precisely the correct point that you have made. If you do not reconcile them, you will have more output and more unemployment. They can simultaneously go on.
It is in that context, therefore, the too much emphasis that we give to privatization has to be viewed, because will that reconciliation be possible? This is one point. Secondly, equally important, when you encourage capitalization of the economy faster in the name of globalization, which is unavoidable, where are the resources to come from? Bank money, foreign finance, is no substitute for the savings of the economy. And a private sector, which is all the time insisting on consumerism and padding it up with a lot of advertisement, how can that build up a situation in which savings ratio may rise? And therefore, you know that since liberalization particularly, the savings ratio of the economy has fallen, and yet it has not come back to its earlier level.
Since we all agree to the point that the output growth, employment growth should go together, what has happened in the last 10 years that we have started seeing jobless growth, where economy is growing at a faster rate today as compared to 80s. 90s have registered a higher rate of growth, but despite that, employment has not increased. Now, in this context, my submission is that how will we take into account the faster changing rate of technology when we talk of globalizing Indian economy, and that we also bring here efficiency. So in the name of efficiency, we are changing the technology. And if new technology is coming, modern industries are coming, they are highly capital intensive, and the extent to which investment is made, they are not able to create more jobs. So the question is, how can we reconcile this technology change and employment growth?
My response to your query would be that as in China, even though they want modernization, they're very selective in respect of the technology. There are certain technologies they're not encouraging at all. There are certain other technologies, information technology for example, they want it first, immediately. So the kind of euphoria which is being generated has to be very selective, number one, so that you can reconcile the growth and employment objective together. Two, the second point, which I would like to particularly emphasize, is the experience of the East Asian countries. Please remember that in East Asian countries, including Korea, Taiwan and others, the first thing which they did was not to going for new technology and everything. They raised their total factor productivity, but they raised the total factor productivity by keeping the capital labor ratio almost the same. They didn't change it. But ethos was generated, and people were educated, human resource development was built up. And these were the methodologies. Only after they had achieved, say for example Korea, by 70s, when they had achieved near full employment in the economy, they took a jump for modernization. The same procedure can be followed.
No, this isn't taking a clue from Professor
Now,
Jha.
Professor Vibhor Dutt has recently visited China, and he has some first-hand knowledge about the growth of the Chinese economy, including the employment aspect. Now, I request Professor Dutt to say something about what Professor Hajola referred to, what China has done to reconcile selective technology as well as employment.
No.
Whether you say your experience as well as its feasibility given Indian conditions.
No, so far as various levels of technology, there are areas in which you must have first-rate technology. For instance, steel cannot be produced in kindergartens, and therefore we must have.
That is why you are talking selective technology.
Yeah. But in the making of biscuits, there is no need of having very sophisticated technologies. We can produce biscuits even with less sophisticated technologies in small scale sector. And there the Chinese, what they have tried is that the ordinary commodities, let them be produced at the local level, at the county level, at the district level. But in sophisticated areas, that is the most modern technologies. Therefore, for instance, in India also, various levels, you can have the making of bread, you can have the modern bakeries, and you can have other bakeries also. So, one should, as Professor Hajola said, try to reconcile. The other aspect which is, I think, very important is that future growth of employment is either going to be in the small scale sector or in the service sector. And the service sector will grow only with better education and development of larger number of services, education, health, which have been areas which have so far not received enough attention. And if we do that, then in modern economies or in developed economies, bulk of the employment is in the service sector. So we have to generate more and more employment in the service sector as well. That will become another absorbing area. And it is in this sense that we have to undertake changes in the economy. But for some time, till the population growth comes down, Chinese, they have been able to bring the population growth down. I was talking to a young lady professor. How many children have you? She said 1. And I said, only 1? She said, if I have a second child, I lose my job. And also my husband loses the job.
So can you apply this in India?
No, that is not possible. But the Chinese, what they have done is in the urban areas, you can't have more than 1 child.
The question here is that, as you have said, that there will be faster growth of the services sector.
Yes.
You have also raised the question of providing health services to the people, better education. The point here is that we are having quite a backlog of educated unemployed in the country. And the services sector is expanding more in the private sector. Even in services sector industries, there are most sophisticated areas which replaces employment. They are not employment intensive to my mind. So the question is, given this situation, there is a general perception that privatization of the economy is not going to take the consideration of unemployment or rising growth of the population. And it is going to be our problem number 1 perhaps, and privatization is no solution for this. So to my mind, when you think of employment generation, how to go about employment generation, there should be a separate strategy for that. Because the privatization, to my mind, is not going to take care of the unemployment problem that we are having. As we have already discussed, that the rate of growth of employment was always higher in the public sector and not in the private sector. So the question is, and that is the basic question for Indian economy today, that when we are privatizing the economy, how to take care of the unemployed backlog, so that should not create social problem.
Those who are advocates of privatization, they are not bringing the employment argument at all.
Yes.
They are
Yes.
only bringing
This is a
the
fact.
profit argument.
Rather they talk about
Efficiency
replacing the labor, as if that is the only remedy.
They think that they say shedding the load,
Yes.
reducing the fat, all these phrases they have
Different terms
invented.
are used.
And but the whole question is, when you are well fed, you have one philosophy. When you are hungry, you have another philosophy. So to the unemployed, it would be a different question. And for a social thinker, for a political thinker, the employment question becomes paramount. And therefore, privatization is not a solution of the employment problem. It can be a solution of bringing a little more efficiency in the system. It can be a situation of giving a jolt to the worker that you have to earn your living and not misuse your security of service in the public sector. That, of course, element of jolt and shock can be given. But privatization will generate a situation of full employment. What are they saying is, have 10% rate of growth for 20 years, then we will be able to reach it. But 10% rate of growth for 20 years may not come about so easily. And therefore, on this question, we will have to depend for some time on the small sector for a considerable period, agriculture for a considerable period, because agriculture continues to be the greatest employment generator.
Fine. We have discussed about pros and cons of privatization in this particular session, and our conclusion in this respect is this, that privatization of the economy is already taking place. The debate is more about privatization of individual public sector units. In this context, we have also considered the employment aspect, particularly the fast changing rate of technology is creating problems for providing employment to all. This has also been pointed out through this discussion, that we can generate, or that will continue for some times to come, in the small scale sector, in the agriculture, or in the unorganized services sector as well. The question here is, there must be some kind of clear thinking as to how to take account of the growth of the economy with equity. And when equity comes, this means reduction of poverty as well as provision of employment. Privatization as such is not going to take care of these things, and therefore there is a definite role for the government, for the state sector, to take these things into account and not shade away by the advocates or slogans of privatization. Thank you, sir.